A single ragged seam. That was the price they put on her soul. Three men, their youth gilded with inherited fortunes and an unearned certainty, sat enthroned at the best table in New York's most exclusive restaurant. Their gazes were weapons, and their target was Nora, a waitress whose only crime was the frayed thread on her shoulder, a tiny flaw in the fabric of their perfect evening. They smirked, they whispered. They catalogued her humiliation with the casual cruelty of kings dissecting an insect. But their judgment was clouded by the blinding glare of their own privilege. They saw a servant, insignificant and isolated. They were utterly oblivious to the history simmering behind her tired eyes, and they could not possibly comprehend the man who was about to step through the door. He wasn't just coming for dinner. He was coming to collect a debt they didn't even know they owed. Stay tuned, because the laughter's about to die in their throats, and the silence that follows will be deafening. The 8 o'clock seating at Ethelgard was less a dinner service and more a coronation. Perched 63 floors above the glittering asphalt arteries of Manhattan, the restaurant was a hushed cathedral of modern capitalism. Its floor-to-ceiling windows didn't just offer a view of Central Park. They presented it as a conquered territory, a dark, sprawling kingdom laid at the feet of its diners. The air inside smelled of old money, truffles, and a faint floral anxiety. For Nora Blake, this rarefied atmosphere was simply the air she breathed for 10 hours a day. She moved through the maze of tables with a liquid grace born of exhaustion and practice, an economy of motion that the patrons mistook for subservience. Her auburn hair, the one vanity she allowed herself, was imprisoned in a tight regulation chignon. Her black uniform was impeccably pressed, save for one tiny traitorous detail on the left shoulder seam of her crisp white shirt, where a few threads had begun to surrender. Her shoes, brutally sensible, were a constant aching reminder of the gravitational pull of reality. Nora wasn't merely a waitress. She was a scholar in a self-imposed exile, conducting fieldwork in a jungle of wealth. She was an art historian, or at least she was trying to be, chipping away at a master's degree at Columbia, one exhausting, overpriced textbook at a time. Ethelgard, with its collection of minor impressionist sketches and abstract sculptures, was both her benefactor and her cage. It paid for her tuition while simultaneously reminding her of the world she had run away from. A world of privilege she had willingly abdicated. She saw the world not in dollars, but in details. She saw the tremor in the hand of the CEO celebrating a hostile takeover, the desperate hope in the eyes of a woman on a first date with a man who checked his phone more than he met her gaze. And she saw the predators. They made their entrance at 8:17 p.m., sweeping past the maitre d' with the assumption that a path would be cleared. There were 3 of them, all in their late 20s, radiating the kind of effortless arrogance that can only be cultivated over generations of never hearing the word no. The leader was Julian Thorne, whose family had been quietly strangling Wall Street for a century. He was handsome in a severe, bloodless way, dressed in a bespoke Zegna suit that looked more comfortable on him than his own skin. He didn't walk. He glided, his eyes scanning the room not for a table, but for his rightful place at its apex. To his right was Carter Sterling, broader and louder, a human exclamation point. His father owned half of the commercial real estate in Soho. Carter wore a garishly patterned Keaton blazer, a desperate peacock's display of wealth. He was the kind of man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes, a booming, empty sound that demanded attention. The third was Pierce Vanderbilt III, a name that was a historical monument in itself. Pierce was slighter, with a perpetually bored expression plastered on his face. His contribution to the group dynamic was to document it, his phone a permanent extension of his hand, curating their existence for an audience of sycophants. Julian Darling, the maitre d', a painfully thin man named Antoine, gushed, his professional poise dissolving into frantic obsequiousness. "We have your usual table ready, of course." He led them to table 42, the prime corner booth that offered a panoramic sweep of the park and the city. It was the deepest table in Nora's section. "Oh, joy," she murmured to Sal, the veteran bartender, as she filled her water tray. Sal, a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights and cynical observations, just polished a highball glass with a weary grunt. "The Princelings are holding court. Watch your back, kid. Thorn's got a bite, and Sterling's got a bark that's just as bad. Nora fixed the Ethelgard smile onto her face, a polite, placid mask that betrayed nothing. The crystal water goblets felt like lead weights on her silver tray as she approached the table. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Ethelgard. My name is Nora, and I will be taking care of you this evening. Julian was already critiquing the restaurant's lighting to Carter, while Pierce was taking a low-angle video of the champagne bucket. Nora, Carter boomed, tasting the name as if it were a cheap wine. He looked her up and down, a dismissive inventory that made her skin crawl. All right, Nora, we'll start with a bottle of the Showeight Krug and have your sommelier decant it. I like it bruised a little. Opens it up. Nora's training kicked in, a shield of professional language. An excellent choice, sir. However, vintage champagne is rarely decanted as it can dissipate the carbonation. Honey, Carter cut in, leaning forward with a conspiratorial smirk. Are you an expert in champagne, or are you an expert in carrying trays? Just do as I ask. Julian finally deigned to look at her, his eyes a pale chilly gray. Just get the wine, Nora. Don't editorialize the order. Of course, sirs, she said, her smile not wavering by a millimeter. She turned, her spine ramrod straight, and walked away. She could feel their eyes on her back, could almost hear the low chuckle. She's a tight one, she heard Carter say. Let's see if we can loosen her up. The next 3 hours became a grueling ballet of psychological warfare, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was never one overt act of aggression. It was a relentless campaign of subtle humiliations. The Krug arrived. The sommelier, a proud Italian named Lorenzo, presented the bottle with the reverence due a holy relic. Julian waved a dismissive hand. Yes, it's lovely. Just pour. When Lorenzo poured a tasting amount for Carter, the man who ordered it, he swirled it, sniffed it, and then declared, It's a bit pedestrian, isn't it? A little one note. Lorenzo's professional smile tightened at the edges. A $2,000 bottle of champagne, one of the finest vintages of the decade, was pedestrian. They ordered the most decadent items on the menu, the beluga caviar, the foie gras torchon, the A5 Wagyu tasting flight. Then they found fault in everything. This caviar, Julian mused, pushing the tiny black pearls around with a mother-of-pearl spoon. It lacks a certain salinity. It's almost bland. Is it fresh? Yes, sir. It arrived this morning, Nora replied, her voice a placid sea. My foie gras is greasy, Carter complained after devouring his portion in 3 bites. It leaves a film. Unpleasant. Pierce took a single bite of his Wagyu, then spent 5 minutes arranging the remaining slices for a photo, captioning it, Meh, had better. They used her name like a weapon, a constant, condescending drumbeat. Nora, this water is no longer chilled to my satisfaction. Replace it. Nora, tell the chef his reduction is overly aggressive. Use that word, aggressive. Nora, do you have any idea what torsion means? Don't look it up, just guess. Go on, entertain us. Nora absorbed every barb, every sneer, with the same infuriating politeness. Right away, sir. I will inform the chef, sir. As you wish, sir. But beneath the calm surface, a cold, hard knot of fury was tightening in her stomach. This wasn't just a job. It was a penance. She was here by choice, a deliberate flight from a life of suffocating privilege, a life not unlike theirs. Her father, Dominic Blake, was a titan of the tech industry, a man who had built an empire from silicon and sheer force of will. He was new money, and he had spent Nora's entire life trying to buy her a world he never had. A world of security, of influence, of tables like this one. But after her mother's death 5 years ago, his well-intentioned care had morphed into a gilded cage of control. He wanted to choose her university, her major, her friends, her future. So she had rebelled. She had walked away from the trust funds, the chauffeured cars, the limitless credit cards. She wanted to prove, to him and to herself, that she was more than a name. She was Nora, just Nora. And these men, these princelings of inherited kingdoms, were a living embodiment of everything she had rejected. They were spitting on her struggle, on her very identity, without an inkling of the irony. The main courses arrived, 3 dry-aged porterhouses and a lobster thermidor. As Nora leaned over to place Julian's steak before him, the strained shoulder seam of her shirt snagged for a split second on the corner of his heavy chair. She felt a faint pop, a tiny release of tension. She straightened up, pretending nothing had happened. But she knew a small, inch-long tear had opened up along the seam. It was Carter who saw it first. His eyes widened with gleeful malice. Whoa, hold on a second, he bellowed, pointing. Nora, what is that? Nora instinctively brought a hand to her shoulder. It's nothing, sir. I must have just caught it. Nothing? Carter laughed, a hyena's cackle. It looks like your uniform is falling apart. Is Ethelgard running a sweatshop now? Julian Thorne looked at the tear, not with amusement, but with a profound theatrical disgust. That is unappetizing, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. To have that disrepair in such close proximity to my food. Pierce, of course, was already filming. Live from Ethelgard, he narrated in a hushed whisper, where the staff's uniforms are as rare as the steak. One tattered service, or nonchalant, fine dining fail. Nora's face burned with a hot, furious blush. The tear was small, barely noticeable, but they had turned it into a spectacle, a symbol of her supposed inferiority. I apologize, sir, she said, her voice tight. I will speak to my manager about getting a replacement. You do that, Julian said, picking up his steak knife. He took one bite of his perfectly cooked medium-rare steak, chewed thoughtfully, and then laid the knife and fork down. This is unacceptable. Nora's heart sank. Is there something wrong with the steak, sir? It's not the steak, Julian said, his eyes fixed on the tear in her shirt. It's the whole experience. It's been ruined. I've lost my appetite. He pushed the $150 plate of food away from him. Mine too, Carter chimed in, having already eaten half of his lobster. Sympathy, nausea, it's a real thing. Take it away, Nora. All of it. The waste was obscene, the sheer wanton waste of it all. The food, the money, the labor of the chefs. It was a physical assault on her senses. Her hands, hidden by her sides, curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. As you wish, sirs, she ground out, her professional smile now a ghastly rictus. She cleared the barely touched plates, her shame a palpable heat on her skin. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she could hear their laughter, sharp and cruel as shards of broken glass following her. She entered the cacophony of the kitchen and placed the plates on the pass. Table 42, she said to the executive chef, a formidable man named Jean-Pierre. They've lost their appetites. Jean-Pierre looked at the pristine plates, then at Nora's face, and finally noticed the small tear on her shoulder. His own expression, usually a mask of culinary fury, softened with something that looked dangerously like pity. He knew those boys. He knew their fathers. The little bastards, he muttered in French. Do not let them break you, mon chéri. They are hollow men. They're not worth breaking, Nora said, more to convince herself than him. She took a deep, steadying breath of the hot, savory air of the kitchen, the only honest air in the whole establishment. Finally, after refusing dessert but ordering another round of ruinously expensive single malt scotch, the ordeal neared its end. Julian made a grand gesture of tapping the face of his Patek Philippe. Well, gentlemen, I believe our time in this establishment is over. The night is young. Check, Carter barked, snapping his fingers in the air. Nora had it ready. The bill, a monument to their gluttony and waste, totaled $9,482.50. She placed the leather folio on the table with a steady hand. Julian opened it, glanced at the number, and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. He looked at his friends, a cruel light dancing in his eyes. All right, boys, let's calculate the service charge. What do we think Nora's tattered performance was worth tonight? Well, Carter began, tapping his chin dramatically, she brought us water, so there's that. But she also argued about the champagne, a major faux pas. And the shirt, Pierce added, looking up from his phone. The visible poverty. It really cheapened the ambiance. I'm going to have to mention it in my review. A cheap ambiance deserves a cheap tip, Julian declared with the air of a philosopher king. He reached into his wallet, a slim piece of alligator skin, and pulled out a thick money clip filled with $100 bills. He thumbed through them slowly, deliberately. Then with a theatrical flourish, he reached into a separate pocket and produced a single, crisply folded bill, a $1 bill. He unfolded it, smoothed it on the table, and then held it out to her, pinched between his thumb and forefinger. "Here you are, Nora," he said, his voice a silken, condescending purr. "For your trouble. Don't spend it all in one place." The other two erupted in howls of laughter. Carter slammed his hand on the table, nearly upsetting a glass. The sound echoed in the suddenly quiet restaurant. The surrounding tables, which had been pretending not to notice the relentless torment, were now staring openly, a gallery of silent witnesses. Nora looked at the single dollar. She looked at Julian's smug, hateful face. She saw the manager, Antoine, hovering near the reservation stand, wringing his hands but doing nothing. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, and in that moment, the carefully constructed dam of her composure didn't just crack, it exploded. She did not take the dollar. She kept her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. Her voice was not the waitress's placid monotone. It was quiet, but it was clear, and it was as cold and hard as diamond. "I cannot accept that." Julian's smirk wavered. He was momentarily confused. This was not in the script. "What? Is your pride worth more than $1?" "No, sir," Nora said, her eyes locking onto his. "My dignity is." Ethelgard has a policy of automatically including an 18% gratuity for parties of 3 or less who behave like complete asses. The silence in the room became absolute. Carter's laughter died in his throat with a wet gurgle. Julian's face, which had been pale with amusement, began to suffuse with a blotchy, dangerous red. He understood. This was rebellion. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he hissed, getting to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "You are a servant. You exist to take what you're given." "I am a server, Mr. Thorne, not a servant," Nora corrected him, her voice unwavering. "And I am given nothing. I earn it. And that," she said, her gaze flicking down to the dollar and back up to his face, "is an insult." "An insult?" Julian's voice rose, cracking with fury. "You want to see an insult?" He grabbed his heavy water goblet, the condensation making it slick in his hand. For a terrifying second, Nora thought he would throw it in her face. Instead, with a guttural roar of pure, petulant rage, he hurled it to the floor. The baccarat crystal exploded, sending shards and ice water skittering across the floor, some pieces landing just inches from her feet. "Clean it up," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "That is what you are good for. Clean it up." The sound of the shattering glass finally broke Antoine's paralysis. He scurried over, his face a mask of sweaty desperation. He didn't look at Nora, didn't look at the mess on the floor. He looked only at Julian, his expression one of frantic, fawning apology. "Mr. Thorne, gentlemen, is there a problem? A misunderstanding?" "Your waitress," Julian snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Nora, "is out of control. She insulted us. She's unhinged." "Yes," Carter chimed in, seeing his cue. "Completely unprofessional. I felt threatened." "I have it all on video," Pierce added, brandishing his phone like a crucifix. Nora finally looked at her manager. "Antoine," she said, her voice shaking with a righteous, incandescent rage, "that is a lie. Mr. Thorne offered me a $1 tip on a nearly $10,000 bill and then threw his glass at my feet." This was Antoine's moment of truth. He could be a manager, a protector of his staff. He looked at Nora, an employee he could replace by lunchtime tomorrow. Then he looked at Julian Thorne, son of a man who sat on the board of the corporation that owned this very restaurant. He made his choice in less than a heartbeat. "Nora," Antoine snapped, his voice turning to ice. "That is enough. You will not speak to our guests with such disrespect. You will not fabricate such stories. The guest is always right. You know the rules." The blood drained from Nora's face. "But I don't care what you think happened." Antoine cut her off, his eyes desperately pleading with Julian for forgiveness. "You will apologize to Mr. Thorne and his friends for your outburst and for this misunderstanding. Immediately." "Apologize?" The word felt like ash in her mouth. "Now," Antoine commanded. Julian's rage subsided, replaced by a slow, reptilian smile of triumph. He had won. He always won. He crossed his arms, waiting for his tribute. "No," Nora whispered. "What did you say?" Antoine's head whipped around. "No," Nora said again, louder this time. Her voice was steady, fortified by the sheer injustice of it all. "I will not apologize for being treated like refuse. I will not." "Nora Blake, you are fired," Antoine hissed, his face inches from hers. "You are fired. Now, for the last time, apologize to these gentlemen and clean up the mess you created." "Yes," Julian added, his smile widening. He nudged a large, sharp shard of glass with the toe of his gleaming Gucci loafer. "Get on your knees and clean it up." It was the ultimate betrayal. She was being sacrificed on the altar of their privilege by the very man who was supposed to protect her. She looked down at the glittering fragments of crystal, at the sneering faces of the three men, at the craven terror in her manager's eyes. Her entire body trembled. A single hot tear of pure humiliation welled up, and she fiercely blinked it back. She would not give them the satisfaction. Slowly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The fight seemed to drain out of her. She looked at the floor. "Yes, Antoine," she whispered. Julian's grin was blinding. Nora knelt, her knee pressed against the cold marble floor. She reached a trembling hand toward the largest, most jagged piece of glass. She would pick it up. She would clean their mess. She would be fired, and she would disappear into the night, another anonymous casualty of a war she never asked to fight. Her fingers were just about to close around the shard of glass, her dignity shattered into as many pieces as the goblet. "I don't think that will be necessary." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense atmosphere of the dining room like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice layered with gravitas and a quiet, unshakable authority that silenced the room more completely than Julian's rage ever could. Every head turned. Standing near the entrance, where he had been observing the scene for some time, was a man in his mid-50s. He wore a simple dark navy suit, but it was tailored with a precision that screamed bespoke craftsmanship. His hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, his face lined with the faint traces of sleepless nights and high-stakes decisions. His eyes, a startlingly sharp shade of blue, missed nothing. He wasn't flanked by bodyguards, but he possessed a formidable presence that made them seem redundant. Antoine's jaw dropped. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. Mr. Blake," he stammered, his voice a strangled squeak. We were not expecting you this evening. You are not in the book." Dominic Blake's gaze swept past the cowering manager as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes took in the scene with a chillingly swift assessment. The three arrogant princelings, the broken glass, and his daughter, his brilliant, stubborn, magnificent daughter, kneeling on the floor. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He walked forward, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpeting. He ignored Julian, ignored Carter and Pierce. He walked directly to Nora and stopped. He looked down at her, and his hard expression softened with a deep, aching sorrow. He extended his hand. It was a strong, capable hand, a hand that had built an empire from scratch. "Nora," he said, and his voice was suddenly, shockingly gentle. "Get up. Please, you'll cut yourself." Nora looked up, her face a maelstrom of shock, shame, and fury. But as she saw her father, something in her expression shifted to a stunned, complicated recognition. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet with a firm, steadying grip, holding on for a moment longer than necessary, a silent, protective gesture. He then turned and for the first time fixed his laser-like attention on the three young men at the table. Julian, Carter, and Pierce were suddenly adrift, their script thrown out the window. "Who the hell is this?" Carter blustered, trying to regain his footing. "Look, pal, this doesn't concern you." "Are you her lawyer?" Julian sneered, his arrogance reasserting itself. "Don't worry, we're not going to sue. We'll just have her fired." Dominic Blake looked at Julian Thorne, really looked at him, with the cold, analytical gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. "Mr. Antoine," Dominic said, his voice dropping back to that icy boardroom calm. "Who are these boys?" Antoine, practically vibrating with terror, rushed forward. "Mr. Blake, 1,000 apologies for this disturbance. This is Mr. Julian Thorne, Mr. Carter Sterling, and Mr. Pierce Vanderbilt. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Dominic Blake." Antoine said the name Dominic Blake with a reverent awe, assuming the name itself would be a thunderclap. But to these scions of old money, a tech mogul from Silicon Valley was just a vulgar upstart. "Blake?" Julian repeated, searching his memory. "Don't know you. Are you in finance? Real estate? You're not in our circle." "No," Dominic agreed, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "You are correct. I am not in your circle. Your circle is a gilded cage built by your grandfathers. My circle is the world. And in my world, Mr. Thorne, you are a guest." "What's that supposed to mean?" Julian snapped. "It means," Dominic said, taking a step closer, "that you are sitting in a restaurant, in a building, on a piece of land that is owned by Blake Industries." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "You are not a patron here. You are a trespasser on my property." The silence that followed. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a hushed audience. It was a vacuum, a void created where sound and certainty used to be. The ambient clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the entire sonic tapestry of Ethelgard had been ripped away, leaving only the high-pitched ringing of shock in its place. The patrons were no longer spectators at a drama. They were witnesses to an execution, and the blood on the floor was purely metaphorical, yet somehow more chilling than the real thing. Julian Thorne did not scramble from the booth. It was a more pathetic, gravitational process. His entire being seemed to collapse inward, the rigid posture of his arrogance dissolving into a boneless slump. The bespoke suit, which had looked like a second skin moments before, now hung on him like a shroud. His face was the color of old parchment, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on a future that had just been erased and rewritten in a language he did not understand. Carter Sterling, the human exclamation point, had been reduced to a quavering comma. He made a small, choked sound, a half-swallowed sob of disbelief. Pierce Vanderbilt III, for the first time in what was likely years, had pocketed his phone. His documenting eye had turned inward, forced to witness the terrifying, unfilterable reality of his own predicament. The two security men, specters in dark suits, did not lay a hand on them. They didn't need to. Their presence was a form of pressure, a quiet herding that was more effective than any overt force. They flanked the exit, their stillness a promise of containment. Julian rose, his legs unsteady. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the table, his hand landing perilously close to the $1 bill Nora had left as his eulogy. He recoiled as if it were a hot coal. Without a word, a single shared glance, or any of their former boisterous camaraderie, the three of them shuffled toward the exit. They were no longer a unit, a pack of princelings. They were three separate, terrified boys, each retreating into the solitary confinement of his own impending doom. The elevator doors slid open, a silent, silver maw, and swallowed them whole. They vanished not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious sigh of a hydraulic pump. The tension in the room did not snap. It slowly, painfully, began to dissipate, like gas from a ruptured line. No one applauded. The act they had just witnessed was too raw, too brutal for something as simple as applause. It felt profane. Instead, gazes shifted, from the empty elevator doors to Dominic Blake, a titan in their midst, and then finally, with a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, profound respect, to Nora. She stood frozen in the center of the room, the adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice now abandoning her, leaving a tremor in its wake. The broken glass at her feet glittered like a shattered constellation. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but they were no longer the pitying or curious stares from before. These were the looks one gives to a survivor of a catastrophe, or perhaps its cause. Dominic moved to her side. His hand, warm and heavy, settled on the small of her back. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. It was not a suggestion. It was the same quiet, implacable command he used to move markets and restructure companies. He began to guide her away, through the maze of tables that were now parting for them as if she were royalty. As they passed the bar, Sal caught her eye. He didn't whoop or cheer. He simply raised the polishing cloth in his hand in a small silent salute. It was a gesture of solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement of the battle she had just won in the trenches they had shared. She gave him the faintest of nods, a flicker of recognition that felt more meaningful than any ovation. The elevator that took them down was a different one, a private express that smelled of leather and ozone. The descent was silent, the floors ticking by in a reverse countdown from a life she had just detonated. Nora stared at her reflection in the polished bronze doors, but she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was pale, her eyes enormous, and the torn seam on her shoulder felt less like a mark of shame and more like a battle scar. Her father stood beside her, a monolith of quiet power. He hadn't said another word. He was giving her space, or perhaps he simply didn't know what to say. He had come to rescue a damsel in distress, only to find she was holding a dragon-slaying sword of her own. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was thick with the weight of 5 years of unspoken words, of arguments they never had, of a chasm they had both pretended wasn't there. They emerged into the cool, damp air of the street-level private garage. A sleek black Audi A8 sat purring, a chauffeur holding the rear door open. The world of Ethelgard, of tips and side work and aching feet, felt a universe away. This was her father's world, the one she had fled, and now it was reasserting its claim on her with the silent, inexorable pull of a black hole. She slid onto the buttery leather seat. Dominic followed, the door closing, with a heavy, soundproof thud that sealed them in together. The car pulled out into the stream of Manhattan traffic, the city lights painting fleeting, abstract patterns across their faces. "Where are we going?" Nora finally asked, her voice raspy. She was looking out the window, watching the blur of life, refusing to look at him. "The apartment," he said. "Not my apartment or home. The apartment." The vast, sterile penthouse on Central Park South that had been their shared space after her mother died. The place that had felt more like a museum than a home. The gilded cage she had so desperately escaped. "No," she said, the words small but hard. "Take me home. To my apartment. In Morningside Heights." "Nora," he began, his voice laced with a weary paternalism she despised. "That's not—" "I am not a child you just picked up from a bad playdate, Dad," she snapped, turning to face him at last. The tremor was gone, replaced by a low-burning fire. "I live there. That is my home. If you want to talk to me, we can talk there. Or you can drop me off and we can not talk at all. Your choice." He stared at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but surprise and a grudging respect. He had seen her intellectual power upstairs. Now he was seeing the force of will that had allowed her to survive without him. He leaned forward and spoke quietly to the driver. The car signaled, making a slow, deliberate turn uptown. The silence returned, heavier than before. The city scrolled past the window, a silent film of other people's lives. Nora's mind was a maelstrom. She replayed the scene in the restaurant, the words she had spoken, the look on Julian Thorne's face. There was no triumph, no sweet satisfaction, just a hollow, aching exhaustion. She had used her knowledge, the one pure thing she had cultivated for herself, as a weapon. She had drawn blood with it, and it felt violating. It felt like a part of her soul, the quiet, academic part that found solace in the brushstrokes of long-dead masters, had been conscripted into a war she never wanted to fight. And then there was her father. The fury she felt was illogical, and she knew it. He had saved her. He had defended her. But he had also, in one fell swoop, erased her. In the eyes of everyone in that room, she was no longer Nora Blake, the competent waitress, the struggling grad student. She was Nora Blake, the billionaire's daughter. He had stormed her independent life with the subtlety of a tank, planting his flag in the middle of her sovereign territory. His rescue felt like an occupation. The Audi pulled up outside her modest pre-war brownstone. It looked absurdly out of place, a shark in a goldfish pond. "I'll walk you up," Dominic said. It wasn't a question. "Fine," she sighed, too tired to argue. Her apartment was small, cramped, but meticulously organized. Books were stacked on every available surface. heavy art history tomes, catalogs, biographies. A corkboard above her desk was a chaotic mosaic of notes, index cards, and reproductions of Sienese paintings. The Lost Madonna, a small, grainy printout in the center. The air smelled of old paper and coffee. It was her sanctuary, and his presence in it felt like a violation. He stood in the middle of her small living room, looking uncomfortable and out of scale, a giant in a doll's house. He took in the worn armchair, the single mug in the drying rack, the thesis notes. He was seeing for the first time the reality of the life she had chosen. "You live like this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. It was the wrong thing to say. "Yes," Nora said, her voice dangerously quiet as she filled a kettle at the small kitchen sink. "I live like this. It's called a budget. It's what happens when you don't own the building. You should try it sometime." "That's not what I meant," he said, his frustration evident. "Nora, what I saw tonight, those animals. To have you kneeling on that floor—" He trailed off, a muscle working in his jaw. The kettle shrieked. Nora slammed it down on the stove, the sound echoing in the small space. She whirled to face him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "And you couldn't stand it, could you?" she accused, her voice trembling with a rage that had been simmering for 5 years. "You couldn't stand to see me in a situation I couldn't control. You had to swoop in, the great Dominic Blake, fixing everything with a phone call and a threat. You didn't just fire Antoine. You didn't just ruin the Thorns. You blew my entire life up as a casual afterthought. I was protecting you," he thundered, his own control finally snapping. "I didn't need your protection," she screamed back, tears of fury finally welling in her eyes. "I was handling it. Maybe I would have been fired. Maybe I would have walked away with nothing but a bruised ego. But it would have been my fight. My defeat. You took that away from me. For 5 years, I have worked my ass off to build something that was mine. A life, a name, a reputation, however small, that had nothing to do with you or your money. And tonight, you burned it to the ground just to prove that you could." She was breathing heavily, the words hanging in the air between them like poison. The silence that followed was different from the one in the restaurant or the car. This one was raw, painful, and achingly personal. Dominic sank onto the edge of her worn armchair. He looked suddenly older, the lines on his face deeper. The formidable CEO was gone, replaced by a tired, grief-stricken father. "When your mother was sick," he began, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it, "I controlled everything. The doctors, the treatments, the schedule, the temperature of her room. I managed every variable. I built a fortress of logistics around her because I thought if I could just control the environment, I could control the outcome." He looked up at her, his sharp blue eyes clouded with an ancient pain. "But I couldn't. I couldn't stop it. I controlled everything, and I still lost her. And I think I've spent every day since then terrified of losing you too." He gestured around the small apartment, at the life he couldn't comprehend. This life you built, it scared the hell out of me, Nora. Not because it's poor, but because I have no control over it. You could get hurt, you could fail. You could be at the mercy of men like the ones tonight. And I wouldn't be there to stop it. Tonight, when I saw you on your knees, it was my worst nightmare made real. It wasn't about my power, it was about my failure. My failure to protect the only thing in the world that matters to me. The confession landed in the center of the room, disarming her rage with its brutal, unexpected vulnerability. He wasn't the titan from the restaurant. He was just a man, haunted by a ghost, trying to anchor himself to the only family he had left. Nora's anger didn't vanish, but it softened, the hard edges blurring. She looked at the corkboard, at the tiny image of the lost Madonna. She thought of her mother, who had been the one to take her to museums as a child, the one who had first taught her how to truly see a painting. "Mom loved Cosarelli," she said quietly, her voice thick. She had a print of his Annunciation in her study. She said his angels looked like they had secrets. Dominic looked over at the corkboard, a flicker of a sad smile on his lips. "She'd be so proud of you, Nora, not for taking them down, but for knowing, for simply knowing." He had tried to give her the world, a world of impenetrable safety and limitless resources. But her mother had given her a different world, a world of beauty and history and knowledge, a world she could carry inside herself. It was a fortress of a different kind, one whose walls he could never breach and whose power he was only just beginning to understand. A fragile truce settled over the room. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a resolution, it was a beginning, a quiet mutual acknowledgement of the deep, complicated love and the equally deep, complicated pain that bound them together. The next morning the world felt different. The sun streamed through her window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But the city outside her window was no longer just her anonymous refuge. News alerts pinged on her phone. Thorne Industries' stock plummets amid rumors of federal investigation. Scandal rocks old money elite. It was distant, abstract, like reading about a war in a foreign country. Her phone buzzed with a call. It was Sal. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice gravelly. "You okay?" "I think so," she replied, the words feeling surprisingly true. "You?" "Well, the old man, Blake, he came by this morning. Fired the entire corporate management team for Ethelgard. Made me the new general manager." He let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "Gave the entire staff a massive bonus for hazardous duty. Says he's restructuring the entire employee compensation and protection policy. Kid, you didn't just slay a dragon last night. You rebuilt the whole goddamn kingdom." Nora smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "You deserve it, Sal." "We all do," he said. "Listen, Nora, your job is here if you want it. Hell, any job you want is here. Just say the word." "Thank you, Sal. It means a lot," she said. "I'll think about it." She hung up, a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. Her father had used a sledgehammer. But in the rubble, things were being rebuilt, better than before. An hour later, another call came. It was her father. His voice was different, less commanding, more tentative. "The director of the Pinacoteca in Siena reached out," he said, getting straight to the point. "Interpol has already secured the painting from the Thorne collection. It's the real one. They want to know if you would be interested in overseeing its official repatriation. They're creating a special curator position. All expenses paid, full academic access." It was the dream, the absolute impossible dream. A culmination of everything she had worked for, laid at her feet on a silver platter. It was a door, not back into his world, but into her own, fully realized. She looked around her small apartment, at the stacks of books and the cluttered corkboard. This was the place where she had forged her own armor, sharpened her own sword. The battle was over. The kingdom was rebuilt. "I have a thesis to finish," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I need to defend it. I need to walk across that stage and get my degree, the one I earned." There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could picture him standing in his vast, empty penthouse, staring out at the city. "Of course," he said, and for the first time she heard not just acceptance, but true understanding in his voice. "Of course you do. The offer will be waiting for you when you're ready." "I know," Nora said. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a billionaire's daughter fighting for independence. She was a scholar on the verge of becoming a master. She had walked into Ethelgard defined by a frayed seam on her shoulder, a symbol of her struggle. But she had walked out defined by the vast, unshakable knowledge she held within her. True power wasn't a name you inherited or a fortune you commanded. It was the quiet, internal architecture of the self, built piece by piece, book by book, in the silent hours when no one was watching. And Nora Blake was, at last, standing on ground of her own making, ready to decide not where she would be sent, but where she wanted to go. The view from here, she thought, was infinite.